Thank you. Thanks so much. Good evening. I've got my cup of Baptist gasoline here, so that'll keep me going. And hey, I'm real excited about a chance to just share some real practical things that have been helpful to me over many years of ministry. Still use them. Learned most of them the hard way. And if I could give you guys a shortcut on not make some of the mistakes I made, I figure our time is very profitable. Thank you for giving some of your time. I was thinking again driving over here, this is another evening meeting for pastor types to get together because everybody expects what everybody else does, and then they want the second mile. And that's not always a bad thing, but it takes its toll. And crisis care does that too. There's no 8-to-5 work on when the hospitals are open or when something happens to somebody. Just tell you a little about myself. I was blessed when I felt a call to ministry. It was early in my life, and I had a chance to go to Southwest Baptist College at the time. That dates me, but it's Southwest Baptist University now. And then I got to go to Southwestern Seminary. Had a little country crossroads church. That's where I began. I told everybody, it is not at the end of the world, but you can see it from there. So it was where two gravel roads met, and it was between Bolivar and Kansas City, where my home was. And during school, we would drive up and back on a Sunday. And if we had gone home to Dad and Mom's on the weekend, we drove home to Kansas City on Friday, got up Sunday morning, stopped and did morning and dinner on the ground kind of things, spent an afternoon with somebody, and then went on back to school. So I don't know that it helped my grades a whole lot, but I sure learned a lot from some great people. I went to seminary. I crammed 3 years into 4. Don't ever give up on your educational goals. Just whack away at them, because that matters. And then I ended up back in Missouri at a little, it's where two paved roads met. I thought I was uptown. Waverly is where Highway 65 out of Springfield meets Highway 24 coming out of Independence. And there's a little Baptist church right there at that crossroads, Waverly Baptist Church. We were there 7 years. And it was a full-time thing for me. We kept trying to get where we could grow a little bit. We had a Hispanic ministry dealing with apple orchards up there. And so I learned a different type, and that's where our association came in, and we were partners with the other churches, but I ended up being the supervisor and kind of the mentor of the Hispanic pastor we had. We were there 7 years, and it was through a pastoral care moment. One of my members passed away, who was the sister-in-law of a member here at First Baptist Church of Mount Vernon, who happened to be the chairman of their pulpit committee, who came to the funeral and said, we need somebody who cares. Let's explore that guy. And that led me to this very place. It wasn't this nice, and we've had a lot of changes over the years, but 16 years here in Mount Vernon and Lawrence County Baptist Association. And I still call it home. We still own a home here. What happened is at the end of the time at Waverly, Southern Baptists had a thing called Bold Mission Thrust. And the goal of Bold Mission Thrust, now this is really old. This is like back in the 80s. Bold Mission Thrust was we were going to share the gospel literally with every person in the world. The goal was to make, not save the world. We don't do the saving, but if Coca-Cola could reach everybody on the planet, why couldn't we if we cared enough? And it was during a January Bible study, one of our associational events, and we were in a church basement that wasn't nearly this nice. But God spoke to my heart, and He basically said, Gare, anybody can get behind the pulpit and tell other people what to do and how much money they ought to give. What are you going to do to make Bold Mission Thrust a reality? And man, I hate it when the Holy Spirit gets kind of personal because it was one of those things where I didn't know. And so in my rural type setting, the National Guard was a way that a lot of farmers had their small acreage, but they were involved in the military, or they were school teacher and they would do a summer camp, that back in the old days. It was a weekend a month and 2 weeks in the summer back then. And I just realized that, it took a seminary degree. It took so many years of full-time experience. I was qualified for that. Was I willing to do it? So at the time, I was wanting to do a Doctor of Ministry degree, a D-Min. And I said, well, I'm kind of at a crossroads. I could do a D-Min, and learn new things, or I could join the Missouri National Guard and use what I know. Guess what happened? So, long story short, that was the beginning of a bit of a bivocational in ministry. It used to be in seminary. I had a job with a paycheck, and I had a church on the side. But now I'm a full-time pastor, and I'm a part-time pastor. And it began to open up a lot of doors. So we came to Mount Vernon already in the Guard, in this church. Instead of me doing revivals, the deal was, I'm going to use the time that you've already set aside for me to do extra kinds of ministries. Well, I'm going to devote it to this. And so that broadened my exposure and my opportunities to outside the ivory tower in a lot of ways. I know a Baptist church is kind of like a wrestling arena sometimes, but we're an ivory tower compared to the rest of the world. So that got me out. It gave me additional training. Then this thing called 9/11 happened, and it really torqued things around. I did get called away from my pulpit for 11 months, and I ended up in Utah. That was another culture shock. There's nice people out there, but they don't think the same. Came back, and I wanted to do a whole lot more, and really the church was nothing but supportive, but there was that invisible curtain that kind of had come down that said, you might have to go again. And that was the truth. I might. And I kind of realized that okay, there's a shift in my ministry. We still own our home here. This is where I come to church when I'm at home on Sundays. Pastor Tim's been nothing but a brother and a friend, and we've seen Ken from Baptist Hill into the associational work, and Terry's been around a while. So I have this 10-year gap in all of my connections in town because I'm a guest when I come home, but I've had a statewide ministry that connects up to the national level. There are 54 guys like me. I am the senior Army chaplain for the Missouri National Guard. There's a group of 20 of us, and we take care of 9,300 soldiers in Fort Missouri. If you go to Fort Leonard Wood, draw a 10-mile circle around Fort Leonard Wood, and you've got military everything. It's the culture, the community, it's all about the military. Well, we have 9,300 guys and 2,300 airmen from Iowa to Arkansas to Kansas to Illinois and Kentucky and Oklahoma, and Fort Missouri is what I take care of. And so it's a very different kind of ministry. And we do deal with crisis an awful lot. Everybody, you know how Baptists are. When they really need you and it's a problem, then they'll call you. When it's really gotten difficult, okay? Soldiers are worse. So a lot of times we call that in our training when we talk about the IEDs, we develop this shorthand, and I don't mean it disrespectful, but it's just the way soldiers talk, is about the boom. When the boom goes off, it's bad. So you got to get ahead of the boom. And we spend a lot of time on that. Yeah, we've got help for afterwards, but if we could prevent that, how much better off are we? So you'll hear a little Army lingo, you'll understand a little bit of kind of where I'm coming from. But I'm excited to get to share with you just some things about crisis and what that is and why we as pastors and caregivers are really important in a time of crisis. In fact, of all the caring helpers in the team that comes around folks who are hurting, nobody else has our job. And the most foolish thing we can do in a crisis is try to be the doctor try to be the ambulance guy, try to be the fireman. They got plenty of those guys. There's only one pastor. There's only one chaplain going to come with this skill set that's going to make a difference. So here's my challenge to you. Chaplain Gary is a good way. Gary is A-OK with this. I'm wearing this because it's a duty day for me, and I'm proud of it. I got to take it off. I'm about done. The Army's told me I've about become all I can be. So I'm Halloween of 18, I am finished and coming back to Mount Vernon, and hey, I hope we get to work together some more. But I want to throw this stuff at you. I kind of made it into a presentation, and you can use this. There's nothing here that's so essential. If you talk to me over any length of time, you might hear some of these old stories again, and please, they're new to me every time. I hope you'll laugh and pretend it's funny. So that would be great. Okay, let's see if we can do some technology here. All of a sudden, I went blinking over here. All right, this is a pastoral care moment. This guy on the right, without the pistol in his hand, that's an officer. The guy on the right is Chaplain Emil Kapan. He was a Catholic priest. He served in World War II and then was called up again to go back to Korea. Korea was a very different conflict for our country because there was all this fear about brainwashing. And in World War I, we had things like, they called it shell shock. World War II, General Patton slapped around some soldiers because he called them cowards, but they really were struggling with a mental breakdown. That's exactly what's happened to this soldier here, and Father Kapan helped find that soldier who is now a weak spot in the defensive perimeter, and he with the commander is bringing this soldier back for pastoral care, medical and chaplain care. He also had the sad duty that's not in this picture of finding the next guy and bringing him out to that very same foxhole. Another guy was going to go right in the place where this guy came out. That is a crisis. This soldier is having a crisis. And Father Kapan was captured when U.S. forces were overrun. He was a prisoner of war and ended up dying of disease in a North Korean prison camp. So he's kind of been one of those role models for me of what we ought to be like. This is Pierce City, Missouri. In 2003, we had, at the end of 2002, we had a little Lucky Lady trailer court tornado out here, and First Baptist Church lost some folks. In the middle of the night was a crisis. And then that spring, Sunday night, we had a tornado that went through Pierce City. The 203rd Engineers are out of Joplin, and they had just been mobilized. So the yellow ribbon on the tree is very kind of important to me because there were soldiers from this town. I don't think this was a soldier's home, but you see what happened to their town when they had mobilized to go elsewhere, and you see the X on the doorway there. That's the search and rescue marking that said they went through that building, and they didn't find anybody. This is a young man that I shook his hand at a memorial service in Iraq, and he went out the next day and an IED hit his vehicle, and he, under that bike helmet, has a metal plate and a part of his skull missing as they were allowing his brain to heal. And we had a promotion ceremony. He put on a rocker. He's now a Sergeant E6, Staff Sergeant. He's no longer in the Guard. His wounds ultimately took him out, but that is a yellow ribbon group meeting where we go and we kind of do some group pastoral care as folks talk about reunions. So I've got 3 yellow ribbons coming up in February for our soldiers. This is at Arlington National Cemetery on a snowy day in late January of 2011. This is the caisson and the honor guard bringing a Missouri National Guardsman to his final resting place. It's hard to see because it was snowing that day, but if you look on the right, me and another chaplain, we were following behind the casket on the caisson. And that's the family on the back. So they were at the top of a hill. We were kind of in the valley, and they were coming up out of the hill carrying him. What a moment that was. Pastoral care when I needed pastoral care. That was one of our soldiers. I did go back, and I did sit down by his grave. And if you look off back there in Arlington, that whole section begins with the Challenger catastrophe. That was they opened up that new section, and all of our Iraq and Afghanistan folks are kind of in that spot. So it's a pretty solemn place and a big vigil. But this is one of our Missouri National Guard soldiers, go Highway 60 about halfway to West Plains, and he lived in the country there. He's on an agricultural development team, teaching folks how to be farmers and raising goats, and was killed by an IED. Another pastoral care moment. This is Joplin. So one of my young chaplains is talking to Mom, and I'm just going to tell you, rather than let's play the guessing game, get on eye level with a person in crisis. So I'm on one knee looking them in the eye. Kids, tell me about this. Said, well, I've been sleeping at my friend's house. Yeah. It's been kind of fun. It's like a lot of sleepovers. Yeah. But I want to come back to my bedroom. And that's her bedroom. So it's not just the grown-ups that go through the crises, okay? And then it's not just the victims that go through that. This was a real surprise to me. We're in a side room. This is Governor Nixon here. That's his wife, Georgia, over there, Director of Public Safety. They're in a waiting room to go out on the stage at Joplin to talk about, hey, these are elected officials. We've got resources that we want to help you with. And he said, well, Chaplain Gilmore's in the room, and before we go out there and face the community, I'd like to ask him to lead us in a word of prayer. It's like, well, what do you know? And his press people took that picture, and it's long gone off the governor's website. The governor's long gone now, but the pastoral care moment is still there. So I just throw out a few things, and I want to throw a few things at you. The first one is, what is a crisis? It comes from the Greek word that means separation. And that word is also a word of judgment. When God's going to judge people, you know, think of Matthew 25. I'm going to figure out what's a sheep and what's a goat. Sheep are going over here, and the goats, that's a separation. That's a judgment. That's a decision being made. And so the original language, that word with a K, is a word for judgment, but it's also where we get the word crisis from. Secondly, it came to us through, well, I don't know what to do. It was going to work out so cool. Maybe I need to reset it because it wants to go to sleep apparently. Well, let me just keep talking and, okay. Well, it came then through the Latin and the Catholic Church where they, now every definition I have is building on the other one. And I'm just showing how over time a word can grow some new meanings. So this in Latin, it talked more about, hey, we're at a critical stage. Then it came into the Middle English where it said, yeah, it's a crisis because this has the potential of not turning out very good. Then we get into more of the modern English. Crisis is a difficult or dangerous situation needing immediate attention. In other words, if you let this thing go, you've really missed it. It's, you know, the building is going to fall, prop it up now kind of thing. So then I added what I call a caregiver definition, and this is what I'm going to be talking about when I use the word crisis. It is an event or a condition where normal coping skills and support systems are overwhelmed and they need support, they need assistance, or they need to be rebuilt. So let's think of the wildfires that we saw in California. All of the normal support systems. The roads were no good. The water was no good. We were overwhelmed by the fire that came through and just destroyed neighborhoods. Down in Houston this year, floods. Overwhelming. And there weren't enough fire trucks. There weren't enough everybody. There's just not enough of everything we need. So the same is true on an individual basis. When you are in a crisis, right now everybody's kind of got things under control and our coping is working, and the biggest complaint I've got is coffee's getting cold. Life is tough. But all of a sudden, what if the wall falls in? Then I no longer have the physical strength or the emotional. When something happens to a loved one, I kind of freak out. I'm overwhelmed. That tidal wave goes over me, and I need an intervention. I need assistance to get my legs under me again. Or sometimes if it's so bad, I need somebody to help me rebuild my network. And that's where we walk into a situation where we can really, really help some people. So, the Chinese say it's a combination of danger and opportunity. And I like to say, I just realized we're just going to have to get ahead of this here. It can be a catalyst for growth. You can come out of a crisis better off than you went into one. Or worse off. All right, we know it's going to be bad for a while, but where do we end up? It's not what happens, it's what happens to what happens. Okay? And then a caregiver, we can go into a crisis situation and we can really make it worse. Or we can help people be that assistant and make it better. That's what I want to talk about, okay? So, all this stuff happens. There we go. Things are waking up. This is a mental health slide from some of my friends, and it just says that, you know what? Every time we go to a hospital, ER, there's a swirl of stuff going on, and every person is processing the crisis spiritually, emotionally, mentally, physically. There's all of those things, and what's exciting is they expect us sometimes to walk in and just make it all better, and it's like, wow, this is a jumbled up mess. So just be aware of that. These are parts of change. We talk about stress a lot. PTSD is, I talked about shell shock and the war wounds. Now we call it PTSD, or really PTS, post-traumatic stress. A disorder is a diagnosis that a real smart person makes, but that hyper stuff that happens to us. The thinker and the feeler get out of balance in our life. And we need somebody who can help us put those back together so that our coping skills and our faith and our family network can come together. So pastoral care is a whole lot of that right there. So there's 4 sources of stress: trauma, loss, conflict, or wear and tear. I am an example of wear and tear. That happens as we get older. Trauma is when that unexpected event can happen, and again, it's a separating of our abilities. Loss and grief, Terry's going to help us with. Sometimes we get tired. Expectations can cause us stress. The way I help diagnose things real fast: mad, glad, sad, or afraid. And I ask myself, is this person angry? Mad? Are they laughing inappropriately? I'm at a funeral and I got the giggles. Well, sometimes that can be healthy grief, and sometimes that can be denial. Which is it? Yeah, mad, sad, glad, or afraid. And you'll find that a lot of people, they may present to you with one thing, but it's really something else. Had a deal with our daughters at one stage. Why are you always so angry? We sat down, we talked about it. Well, she wasn't angry, she was afraid. And that anger was a cover. So, hidden issues, I've got another slide on those. So, if you want to doodle, this is a good little chart. Let me explain this. That line in the middle, that it says baseline over there and it says a new normal over here, that's where you begin. Let's just assume that that's normal for you. Whatever normal is, I don't know, let's say a member of your church is involved in a car accident. I'm making this up, okay, but we're going to use this as an example, all right? They're involved in a car accident, but before the car accident, life was normal. And they were just cruising along, minding their own business, and out of the blue, boom. Well, there was an instant before that, pre-crisis, before impact, where they had an emotional reaction. It's too late to grab the seatbelt. It's too late to secure the kids. It's too late. But your body goes, I sense danger, and yeah. And then what happens? Emotionally, after impact, you end up at a point usually where it drops. True example, I was with my dad one time on a Sunday afternoon, and we were driving down the road. So there's like a highway here, and we're on the service road. And it was a 2-lane service road, and some guy thought he was on the highway for the car in front of us, and he was coming straight at this little girl driving a car in front of us. And she, not knowing what to do, she turns the wheel and she goes down in the ditch. The car swerves around us. We pull over. My dad runs and checks on this gal, and she says, man, he really scared me. I think, remember? Real high, and then, excuse me, real low. And Dad says, well, tell you what, I think you're in a good place. You just drive out of here. We're going to stay here until you go. Okay, so he gets back in the car, explains to me, hey, she's all right. She's just going to drive out. And we wait, and we wait, and we wait, and we wait. And Dad gets out of the car, and he walks up, and he says, hey, honey, are you really okay? And she says, you know, sir, the weirdest thing is going on right now. Every time I put my foot on the gas, it begins to shake. And the truth of that matter is, that's not weird at all. That's actually pretty awful healthy. So she comes down into this overwhelmed part, and there's trial and error where I am regrouping my okayness, and I'm going to make a decision. I engage my coping mechanisms, and my decisions then take me to a new place. Some people can end up below where they were before. We have in our mind, well, if I could just get back to the way it was before the event, I'd be okay. And other people say, wow, when they did the x-ray, they found a brain tumor. I was going to die if I wasn't in that accident and had to go to the ER, and they end up at a very different new normal. Isn't that interesting? We can just, off the top of our head, make up all of these potential outcomes. Let me show you this for soldiers. We're going to do a mobilization. The family in your church is feeling real normal. And then all of a sudden, oh my gosh, I'm going to go to war. And we have all this anxiety, and then we get them together and we march them out, and we're all praying. We're thanking the Lord for them. We're waving flags. We got the band out there. The governor will come give a speech, They march out the door, and in 2 weeks they're sitting in a plywood village in Iraq. And there's nothing green. When I got home, green was my favorite color. There was no green anywhere over there. And then they go through a phase of, how am I going to get along with this? And my splotches there are just decisions, and they make decisions, and well, that didn't work. Well, that worked kinda. That worked okay, but this would work great. That happens to the family. Oh, he's gone, I'm so proud. And then I come home, and here's the trash overflowing in the kitchen. Doesn't he know it's his job to take out the trash? Where is that guy when you need him? What are we going to do? He's going to be gone a long time. Well, now we have to reassign who's going to take out the trash. And we bobble. I call that The booga 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 phase right there. That's my name for that. It's where we're trying on new things. Now, you hang on to that thought right there because I'm going to come back to it in a little bit. I think that is a real important phase for the pastor to be there. Okay? Because you can help them make good decisions that will take them to a better normal on the other side of their experience. Okay? So that looks like a mist. You kind of got the basics. As we move from left to right, emotionally we go really high, we go low, we wobble a while, and then, okay, those coping mechanisms begin to, I got this, I can do this. My Amanda's a physical therapist. She's got you by the gown in the rear end, and you're learning to walk again, and all of a sudden you are putting your normal back into place. Now, it may be a new normal, but you are through the crisis. Okay? There's a lot of effects. This affects deployment. What was a soldier's life like before deployment? What did he do while he was gone? What happened? You know, like that one young man came back with a head injury. That was a tough thing. A lot of other guys came back with stress, hidden injuries. Others came home and they had marital issues or job issues. So what happened while they were gone? And then what was it like? Did they work with us? Did they help us? So that's just kind of a checklist I use. These are things that really bother people. When we have some core beliefs about things, it really matters. One of them is that this wasn't fair. That person shouldn't have been at the bar before they got in the car. I lost an aunt to a drunk driver, a 15-year-old, 3 girls out joyriding. Killed my aunt and a 6-year-old cousin. What do you bet I think about alcohol in teenagers? Okay? So that's not just, that's not fair. You know what really hurt is when one of those girls sued my uncle to pay for her plastic surgery after the accident. I didn't think that was very right. It affected me. Value in trusting others. Well, what if you trust somebody who is untrustworthy? Self-esteem. Can I change my world? Can I control my world? Senior adults go through this one. You know, I used to, you watch the news and it's all the pills about Alzheimer's, how I can't shave or tie my shoes anymore. I've got to take care. Well, you know how devastating that really is? Oh my gosh, for 30 seconds I can put up with it. If it was 10 years, oh man. And then safety, order, and stability, and children shouldn't die. The hardest crisis you will help people through is when a child dies. I heard a stat one time, 80% of the marriages don't make it when a child dies. Yeah, that hurts. That hurts. Okay, I'm gonna hurry this along here, I think. All right, here's my little way. Here's the practical stuff that I'm gonna throw you. I'm gonna give you an acronym. That's an Army thing, which means think of this to remember that. And I want you to remember the word push. So the letter P stands for presence. We call it a ministry of presence. Why do they call the pastor when someone gets taken to the hospital? They want you there. It's important for you to show up. But let me tell you why it's important for you to show up. I call it the envelope, the event envelope. If you come alongside them in their time of trouble, you are on the inside of what they're going through. If you aren't there or the church is not represented, you are not helpful. That isn't fair. It isn't always right. It's been Christmas Day and I've gotten phone calls. And it isn't fair to the family. But you're in the envelope or you're not. Now, we're blessed. I've seen you guys already. You got really good phones. They text, they take pictures, they call. They're all in one. I never had that. I had to get in a car and drive an hour and a half to Columbia from my church, or Kansas City. We were right on the edge of the catchment area, and it was an hour and a half, which either way I went, it was just 3 hours of drive time to be there. I've also come on things where there's an accident. We had a deal. I had just gotten back from my 11-month deployment out in Utah, and I'm driving to the coffee shop for the good old boy get-together again, and somebody did a fender bender on a school bus. I'm there, I stopped, and I'm helping children out of the bus. Guys, I was in the envelope. Kids, let's come over here, let's talk. I'm going to keep you safe. The policeman's doing his thing, they're doing that thing. Let's get out of the road. Your dad and mom may be showing up, and they are going to be a little emotionally high. But I want them to see us. We are right here, and I am here with you. You guys all right? A little different going to school today, huh? What am I doing? Helping them come to normal, getting the group together to re-engage our shared coping skills, and it's going to be okay. All right? P is presence. U means understand. So remember my little model? I just kind of gave the example. Where are you in that model? Are you in the pre thing? We usually aren't called on the pre thing. We're after the boom, usually. We are after it's there. But are they going down? Are they still having this emotional crash? Or are they at the spot where, oh, the doctor just came and talked to us and I don't know what we're going to do? Well, that's that booga phase of indecision and whatever. And if you've been invited into that envelope by your presence to be there with them, you personify and represent the Lord's presence there with them. Okay? So, size, scope, intensity, duration. What's interesting is that little cycle can happen in the same event over and over again. We've dealt with terminally ill, where every time they go to the chemo, it's another crisis. We go through the emotional up and down, and the wave is another way to think of it, okay? And so sometimes you've got multiple people in multiple stages, but you have to say, hey, where are you? What's going on? How can I help? Now, this is why that little wave model matters. If you know where you are and you can kind of gauge based on just your observations and common sense, well, I think this person is doing well with it. Grandma's doing well with it, but here's this 6th grade little girl bawling her eyes out. She's in a different place. Maybe she's the one who needs my attention and comfort, okay? Now, I want to be real blunt with you. Know your role and do your job. You are not the sheriff. You are not the law enforcement. You are not the fireman or the ambulance person. And let me tell you again, I've hinted at it, they're going to be there and they're large and in charge and they got egos. Lord love them. But that's how they cope with all that stress. You're the pastor. You can be a helper, a go-between between them and the families. And that little bus illustration, I tell you honestly, I've learned if I will connect and say, I'm a pastor or I'm a chaplain, and this is what I am going to work with this group of the situation, and you're free to do your job. I'm going to do my job, but I'm not going to do your job. If you're ever in an emergency room, the way they train us is every person in the ER has their job. Your position is at the head of the bed where you can lean down and speak into the ear of that person. And you can touch them. Rarely have I ever been there, but that's how they train us. And you're always taking your cues from the law enforcement guy in charge. Whoever's in charge of that disaster site, could be the fire chief or the doctor. You're there. And I find that if I'm not allowed to be with that person who is in immediate medical crisis, my next question is, where's the family waiting room? So if I can be right there, I will. If not, I'm going to go and like when we had those tornadoes, our church needed pastoral care. We gathered in our fellowship hall and we began to mobilize. Who's got water? Who's got a truck? Who's got chainsaws? It wasn't for the immediate go through and stabilize the scene, but it was for the aftercare. But it's just as much a crisis, okay? So presence, understand. The letter S is the word shape. Now remember that booga, booga, booga phase? That's where you're so important. Well, the doctor said this, do we need to go on life support? What could you say? Now, let me caution you. Anything you say will really matter. What about this decision we have to make? What about this? What about that? I had one just recently. We had a death, and we had a wife who was really hurting. And there was tension in the extended family, okay? So see the target? We had the loss, and we got the immediate family, and then we have the second tier of the larger family. And the wife says to me, in the booga, booga, booga phase, if they show up, we're going to have a fight in the funeral home. Well, let me just ask you, do you think that'd be helpful? Would that help anybody grieve and get through this? No. So that gets thrown out there, and they look at me. What I say next is very important. I can either affirm what was said, I can redirect what was said, or I could put down what was said. And I think my comment was, I don't think that's going to be helpful to anybody. Why don't we just make sure that we don't have a conflict like that? Let's get ahead of that and not let that happen. Because that isn't honoring to our loved one, that isn't going to help our family, and we're all hurting right now. Did I shape that? In a small way. In a small way. So, here's the Gilmore ice cube theory. If I have my cup of hot coffee right here and I have a bowl of ice cubes and I'm trying to change the temperature of that coffee, I take one ice cube. Now, this is boiling hot. I drop that ice cube in. What happens to that ice cube? It's gone pretty fast, right? And a lot of my great ideas are kind of like that ice cube, okay? But what if I keep dropping those ice cubes into the water? What happens to the coffee? It does. And that's what I mean by shaping it. Am I in charge? Is the funeral director going to ask what I want the family to do? It's the family's decision, not mine. But who's there to help them? Who's there to support them? That's me. Who's come alongside them to represent faith and hope and joy and love and church and God? So when they say, well, I'm going to act in a way that really doesn't bring up the best Christian values I know, I don't need to get my Bible out and whap them on the head. I just need to put my arm around them and say, that isn't really how we feel. I can shape it. Doesn't always take on the first time. Keep dropping those ice cubes. And help them come to that place where, what's interesting is they'll often say, that's right. I don't know what Yeah. So, you know what? They were in crisis. They needed us. Presence, understanding, shape, and then hope. Hope is our anchor. Hebrews. See, once we get to that place, now is a better time to bring in Scripture rather than, well, you should have known better than to do that. That isn't real helpful. So hope. Romans 5. Let me just read it. I think I wrote it. I can look it up. Believe it or not, we do use this book in the Army. It's just that the print has gotten real small these days. But I love this passage, and it's where Paul comes to us. Now, of course, the pages stick together. He says, "Therefore, since we've been declared righteous by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. We have also obtained access through him by faith into this grace in which we stand, and we rejoice in the hope of the glory of God." Their salvation. "I'm persuaded neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor car accidents, nor alcohol abuse, or runaway children, or anything can separate us from the love of God." But it's a crisis. But then he goes on, and not only this, we rejoice in our afflictions. That's the same word, crisis. "Because we know affliction produces endurance, endurance proven character produces hope, and that hope does not disappoint us because God's love is poured out in our hearts." And believe it or not, I think you could take that right there over my little model of the wave and go, we may go through the valley, but we have hope. We can come out on the other side of this better than we went into it if we'll work with God in these times. And there's a lot more verses that I won't go. Push. Presence, understanding, shape it, and hope. We represent hope. I had a pastoral care prof in seminary. He said one day he felt really positive and cocky. And he said, "I know you're in the hospital, but I'm your pastor and I'm going to help you through this." And I've never said that, but I said, you know what? That's exactly what we do. I have one other thing I want to go back to just a little bit, because I brought this really cool book. And it's about presence. You know, when you show up and you're not the guy in charge. Maslow had this hierarchy of needs, and you've got to have physical, you need air, you need water, you need your blood flow. This is emergency medicine. And then you need safety, and then you need to belong. Well, I'll just tell you the story. I won't read it. But this is another Catholic priest on the USS Franklin. They got within 50 miles of Japan on a sneak attack, and they got found out, and their ship got bombed. This was the ship that was the worst damaged ship that ever made it back to port. It's amazing it didn't sink. He's a Catholic priest on there. The flight deck, after these bombs hit, one there and one there, he's in the middle, and there's wounded, and there's fires. The ship is on fire, and it's now becoming another target for all these other planes. And he and the doctor are on the deck. They're laying out the wounded, and he said, you know what? It was extremely hot where the fire was, and it was extremely cold everywhere else. And here are wounded men freezing. They're going into shock. And he said, I don't know what made me think of it, but I had walked around the ship and I'd found out where everything was. He said, you and you go get 2 friends apiece and go down the hatch to this place and bring me blankets. And if you can't get blankets, go down to the bunk room and get mattresses, because these guys laying on the cold deck in shock are going to die unless we minister to their physical need first. The most spiritual thing that this chaplain did in the middle of a crisis was a physical thing that helped them. I've been an IV pole. I can do that. I can hold up the IV. Let the other guys work. Hey, I am here. We are with you. Okay? Really matters. All right. Those are the big questions you work through. I got to hurry up here. There's a whole lot of good stuff, but you end up with trusting God for the next step. There are ways through this, but I've already given you the keys there. When we bring what no one else brings, is when we bring hope, we're bringing God into that situation. And you don't have to know what that is yet, but God knows. And He didn't ask you to fix it. He just asked you to come alongside them and be their friend, be their pastor. And then these are Somebody says, I don't feel right, that bullet number 2 on the right. Some emotions are just comparisons. I don't feel happy. So, sometimes you shouldn't feel happy. And happy compared to what? Well, you know what? That normal that you had, it's gone. And we're figuring out how to feel now in the rest of it. So, it's coming together. All right. Here's the thing for you. You need to have a support team in your world because you're going to go through a crisis too. A crisis in another person's life can become a crisis in your life. So, this PhD is telling us, take care of yourself. In all these big words, he says, you know what? You've got to have it figured out about God and crisis in your world, because that you will either find fulfillment in ministering to other people in crisis, or it will take you down. That's what he's really saying. And then his third bullet here is, we've got to get past how we're helping everybody else and figure out how we're going to help ourselves too. And we got to care as much about helping ourselves so we can do something for everybody, rather than just giving us all away and burning out. And I thought of that and I said, you know what? That may not be for you guys. That one's for me, because I got to take care of me. No one else is going to take care of me. If I don't take care of me and have something to give, I'm no help in a crisis. Okay? So, question, comment, old war story. You guys have been great. You've been soaking this up. It's not real complex, but nobody ever sat down and told me how to do that. But I have found that little methodology of, hey, this is what's going on, if I'll give it a push, sometimes it ends up at a funeral. Well, I'm giving hope there. Sometimes it ends up in physical therapy. I'm giving hope there. Sometimes it's the kids are having to re-enter back into school. Well, we walk with them and give them hope. Sometimes it's a broken relationship or whatever. I mean, with that little thread to pull on in the middle of anything, anytime I was overwhelmed, it was like, well, no. It's a different context, but these principles will get us there. All right? Going once?
So what do you personally use for an outlet to separate that time?
Yeah, me personally, I get up real early in the morning and I journal. That's where I process a whole lot of stuff, is that when it goes from here and here, they meet at the shoulder and come out through the pen. I'm not this good. No one cares, no one reads it but me. But that's where I go, man, I really struggled with this. Looking back, I could have done that. I did that right. And here's where I think we're going to go. That really helps me. Sometimes it's just bullets. I just draw a dot and a thought. But that helps me. I'm now the senior leader of my group of 20 chaplains. They don't want me to confide all of my fears. They look to me to have the answer. I don't got the answer. I go figure out the answer. But that and staying in the book and a few close friends, that really helps me. Yeah. Now, other people, hey, they go, they're extroverts or they're on email or websites or whatever. Pad of paper and solitude helps me buffer out the high adventure times, the big activity times with the me time. So, great question. Find something. Some guys fish, some guys fix cars. I'm not that smart. Fish don't like me. So, yeah.
I was in a situation one time where I was kind of close to the situation of an elderly lady that was sick. It was like an ongoing cancer battle.
Yeah.
In her early 90s, it was pretty clear that she was going to make it very much longer.
Yes.
Other man, I don't even remember what guess. What I mean is, I have to find a way to not get locked up by being afraid I'm gonna say something wrong and just say it, the Spirit leads me to say it. But I also try to pay attention to what
Yeah.
is that something you've encountered?
Yeah, no, listen, tact is always essential. But there are times when you have to speak the truth in love. But I find the way I have phrased that matters so much. I said, well, you know, it's true how we feel about this situation, but the facts are, you know, I've just learned in my experience sometimes people are more ready to go than we are ever ready to let them go. And just that little lather before the shave sometimes can really help that other. And that's where I'm saying, you know, a pastor can come in and go, well, she was going to go anyway. Oh, he made the crisis worse. Yeah. No, your tact, your understanding of where they're at. You see, I know we have ultimate hope, but I still cry. You know? And I don't need you to whap me at that. I'll get there, but I'm not there right now. So there are times, and I've had to say, you know, this is my frustration, what I journal. We didn't get all the way there. This didn't sew up in 10 minutes, you know. Or my funeral service didn't make everybody feel good. But I opened that door for that healing to come. And I've had to say, sometimes better than we started is a good day. So, yeah, good words.
My name is Terry LaSalle. I'm a senior adult minister right now over at First Baptist Marionville. So I work with senior adults, but you know, you do a lot of pastoring there. In fact, a lot of them call me pastor. And so that's what I'm doing now. Like I was telling you a while ago, I graduated from Miller High School in 1970. I was lost. I didn't get saved until I was 20 years old. And when I got saved, I really didn't get involved in church right away, but we ended up going to a church where there was a young couples class, and I began to see men that were similar to me, but they were different because they were following the Lord. And I really grew there, and I ended up surrendering to preach in 1974 November, and I knew I wasn't smart enough to do that, so I went to college in January of 75. And had some ups and downs, but God's always with you. Had our last child, and I stayed out for about 3 years and then went back and finished up. So I was on the 10-year plan. SBU was a college when I started, and when I finished, it was a university. So I really brought it along. So education does help, and but there's a lot you can learn in many places, pastors' conferences, and just if you read a lot of things. And so I know some good pastors that never went any further than high school, but they're readers and just that type of thing. So don't let that stop you. I'm going to talk more about crisis care during a dying process. And I don't know why my throat's giving me trouble. Okay, first thing I want to say, and I'm sure Gary would agree with this, is to stay calm. I'm right now also volunteering as a chaplain at the Mercy Hospital in Aurora, and that's one thing he went over in our last meeting, to stay calm. Because if you don't stay calm, you're not going to be able to keep the people you're working with calm. And so we have to be that way, and I put this down, act like you know what you're doing, even if you don't. You know, have confidence in yourself. You probably know a whole lot more than what you think you do. You don't have a legal authority, but the position, as Gary was talking about, pastor or chaplain, kind of gives you a moral authority that people will respect in most cases. And some cases, not so much. But first time I dealt with a dying person, besides my dad, I was in my first church. I was 28 years old, and I was pastoring that church, and it's a good little church. And we had some older people, like most do. And they told me that so-and-so's in the hospital, and he's on hospice, and he's going to die. And I never even knew this guy. So, my duty, I went and visited him, and I was scared to death. I mean, what do you say to a dying guy? And the thing of it was, he gave me more comfort than I gave him. I'm going to be all right. The Lord's taking care of me. And so a lot of times you get a blessing, and I was a hospice chaplain for 10 years. I kind of left that out. My ministry as a pastor is mostly bivocational. I did have 3 or 4 years I was full-time. But I was a full-time hospice chaplain for 10 years, and so I ran into a lot of situations with people dying. I got to thinking about that, and probably in 10 years, I probably had 2,000 or so different patients because we had 45 or 50, sometimes 60 on service all the time. And 10 years is a long time. It's really a long time for me because they usually don't put up with me that long. You are dealing with the whole family. As a pastor, you'll usually know somebody. As a chaplain, a lot of times I'd go in and I didn't know anybody in the family, didn't have any idea whether they believed in the Lord or, worshiped the devil as far as I knew. But it does help to have a little bit of background, and usually in that situation, people will talk. They don't, they give it up a little easier than what you may think. And so even though you don't know them, you can be a help and listen to what they have to say. If you have a bed patient that is barely conscious, my approach, if the family is around and there's a bed patient that's really sick, I ask them if it's okay to touch him or is it okay to hold the hand, because I don't want to come in and make it look like I'm putting family as secondary. And, as a chaplain, I also backed off when their pastor came because, I didn't want to try to look like I was trying to take his place either. And so you got to have respect for the family, and they recognize that when you do respect them. I also ask if it's okay to pray with them. And I've only had one time, maybe 2 times, but one time I remember because it was pretty stern, and they were Jehovah's Witnesses. And they didn't want me praying for them. I don't guess my prayers would have got out of the upstairs window. I don't know. But a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses were much more friendly than that. So even if you know that they're not Christians, it's good to pray with them. And they'll usually say, yeah, I'll take prayer, even if they're not Christians. And like Ken said a while ago, there's some that make a commitment right towards the end. I've had a few when I was a hospice chaplain that, they got saved just not too long before they died. So never give up on a person. Of course, the CNAs, the nurses that give them the baths and everything, they could be a little more blunt. And we had this one, Jane. My goodness, she got to knowing a guy at nursing home over in Crane. And she just told him, if you don't change, you're going to hell. You know what? He got saved before he died. Yeah. But she had a relationship that's really, when you give people baths, you get relationships. I worked in a nursing home for 3 years too, and if someone didn't show up, even though I was manager, I had to do the baths and that kind of thing. So you get to know people that way. It's interesting.
You listened to her, didn't
Yeah, I did. But he wouldn't have cared for me enough for me to say that. But she was with him 2 times a week for, about an hour each time. So they got to be friends, and he knew she said that because she was concerned. And that's another thing. We have to truly be concerned and have compassion for people, or they're not going to be very accepting of us. I put down that we don't want to try to answer things that only God can answer. Gary hit on that a little bit. We don't have all the answers. Some people come in with, well, it's just their time, or this or that. And God has another plan. I hate it when they say God needed an angel, because you don't become angels when you go to heaven. But you hear all kinds of things, but I just try to put it in God's hands. And, they ask me questions. If I don't know the answer, I'll just tell them only the Lord knows, or you may find somebody else that might have an answer to that. But there's some things that don't have an answer, and you just have to put it in the Lord's hands. One of the things, was it because of his or her sins? Well, sin is the reason anybody dies. It's the reason we die, because when sin came into the world, we began to die, and everyone has died ever since. And so there's no way to get out of that. But it may not be your particular sins. Gary was talking about his aunt being killed by drunk drivers. It wasn't her sin, but it was their sin. So one way or another, it is sin, but it's a tender situation when someone's really sick and hurting like that. So don't try to determine whose sin it is, but you can agree that it is sin. The whole family's affected when death happens. It's a great loss. It's a loss of life, but there's loss with the patient too. Some people don't think about that. But consider 6 months ago, you didn't know you had cancer. And all of a sudden the doctor says, you got cancer and the tumor's already so big, we just can't operate. And we're going to have to put you on hospice. Well, immediately, relationships change. The kids, instead of looking at a father, they're looking at somebody they need to help. And it's almost an immediate switch there. There's a loss of friendship sometimes. We had one guy, he was in Aurora, and nice guy. He had been going to the same barber for 15 or 20 years. And so his wife went down and asked the barber if he would come to the house and give him a haircut. No, I can't do that. I don't want to see him like that. And that's really tough. It's not about you, it's about them. And that's something you have to remind yourself all the time. A lot of times there's financial loss, loss of self-esteem. If they go into a nursing home, there's a lot of material loss when they downside. And so the patient often is in a time of grief even as he's dying. So that's something to consider there. I don't have a real fancy presentation. They have the 5 stages of grief, and I could talk about that. But what I'm going to look at is 10 different things that often happen during this dying process or right after death. And okay, not necessarily in this order.
I got a question. Can we make a copy of your material?
If you want to, if they got a place here. I don't know.
Because it's very interesting.
Okay. Okay, I appreciate that. Well, first of all, there's a state of shock. And like I said, these don't always come in the same order. And you don't always just go through them and never go back. You may be in that stage where you're angry, and then you think you're past it and something comes up and reminds you, and you slip back into that angry stage. So this isn't something that's just 1, 2, 3, 4, oh, they're done now, everything's okay. It just doesn't work that way. But there is a state of shock usually right at the beginning, and it can come from really any great loss. If you're a pastor, I can tell you, someone that's been through a divorce, I think that's in a way is worse than death, because you got somebody alive that doesn't want to live with you. My ex-wife didn't want to be a pastor's wife, and she wasn't going to be a pastor's wife. And so it was either give up preaching or give up her. And, well, it's obvious what I chose, but God took care of me. So there is stress there, as well as grief, financial loss, loss of health itself. And, I'm 65 now, and we get to talking more and more with people my age, and we're realizing that you have to be pretty tough to get old. It's not easy. You have to hang in there. And a lot of people, honestly, people at the church I'm working with now go back to the hospital and have another procedure and back to the hospital and have it. And I just wonder, would I even do that? Would I have that much courage and want to live that bad? And, I guess I won't know the answer till I get there, and maybe by the grace of God I won't. But there's a lot of courageous people that are doing everything they can, and not just for themselves, but for their family and their wives and so on. But anyway, loss of health can bring a lot of grief, and then the loss of life. A Christian always finds hope in God's Word. There's a lot of little things like this. This is called The Vest Pocket Companion for Christian Workers by R.A. Torrey. And he's just got subjects in there like what to say, the best text for backsliders is that one. And he's got them all in here. The best text for those who entertain false hopes. And that's a real good little booklet. But what I did is I took the verses I'd use the most, and I wrote them down in my little Bible. But you know what? I lost my little Bible a while back, and I got to do it again. But I usually carry a little Bible rather than a big one. I usually carry a pocket Bible so I don't come in and look like I'm trying to bang people over the head with the Bible. But you like it there so you can refer to some verses at times. I just throw that in. The person who's losing their loved one is, like I said, talking about the shock. And even if they know they're going to die, a while back, she's really one of my good friends now because her mother was on hospice off and on for 3 years, so I visited about every month. And Connie's about a little younger than me, and even though she was a church member, even though I'd been visiting and we were friends, when her mother died, she just kind of went into a daze and she forgot to call the church. She called all the family and everything, and of course they all came to her house, so she had a lot she was doing, so I don't blame her. But all of a sudden we're on church Sunday morning and her funeral was yesterday, so that was kind of bad. But not only did she get in a daze, her sister did. That just happened to be the time that her sister was actually interviewing for promotion. And so, had all this going on. Her mother just died and they offered it to her. And, oh yeah, I'll take it. And she didn't think about it very much because the promotion meant that she'd have to go to Branson instead of Mount Vernon. And so about a month later, her sister says, I don't know why I took this job. It doesn't pay that much more. And I go down there and there's not that many people that I really supervise. And she's kind of sorry she took it. But if you can do anything to help people, it's to help them hold off on making a big decision, really for a year after a loss, but at least for 6 months. Because I've made a lot of mistakes when I was going through things and panicked. There is an expression or emotion of anger. Sometimes you get the numb feeling and then the anger. You think of it as your body getting the bad cut. You get a cut, you don't necessarily feel it right off. And then you get to the hospital quick enough and they'll put the deadener in it and they'll stitch it up. Well, this isn't bad. Next morning you'll wake up, oh! And that happens in death too. Someone, you're really busy when you're getting ready for the funeral, like I was talking about Connie. And so you got a lot to do. And life is just going on without you even thinking about it. But then suddenly the funeral's over, the family goes home, and guess what? You're sitting there wondering what happened. And then you're beginning to think about my mother, my relationship. And Connie was the one who was her caregiver. Connie actually was able to retire early and stayed with her 24 hours a day, basically. So I saw that in her too. And even later on, I talked to her and she'd tear up a little bit. So we got to understand that. Depression and loneliness, and that's kind of what I'm talking about now. Depression's a big problem in our society anyway. I heard the other day that 1 out of 10 people deal with depression. And personally, I deal with depression. So it gets to be a problem for me too. Most of the time I deal well with it. But some days, and it's not so well. Well, somebody goes through a bad experience of loss and a loss of a loved one, if they've already have that tendencies for depression, then it's going to really flare up. And so don't think they're crazy or don't think they're sinful. Just have compassion for them. And like you've already talked about, a lot of people don't need a lot of words, but they need your presence maybe at times, just to know that for them to know that you love them and you really do care about them. And again, this is where Scripture can really help. I went to a counseling training actually last weekend, and it was really good. And they were a biblical counseling, and they're accredited. And you know, if I wanted to go through all the things and read all the books, I could be too. I don't know if I'll go that far. But you know, Bible verses is what they use, and just over and over again. And if you look through the Bible, look through something like that, you can find a verse that's appropriate for whatever the situation is. And so that's a big help, probably more after the death for the family than what it might be before. So you can think of that. Some may experience physical symptoms, and they're very real. They may be psychosomatic illnesses, but you know what? If it's psychosomatic, it still hurts. And I don't understand that myself, but that is, it is a fact. There is such a thing. So have compassion for them there. You know, a lot of people want to say, okay, you've grieved long enough, let's get up and get with it now. And they think they're helping because, you know, they're getting them to get up and move around and go. But some people go through grief longer than others, and they go through this period of having physical symptoms or having depression. As a chaplain, I guess one of my hardest ones is when we had a 3 or 4 year old that had cancer. And, you know, they wanted her to live so bad. She had 2 older siblings. I think one was a brother and one was a sister. And they'd take it to St. Louis, and the only thing they found to do was give it steroid shots. Give her steroid shots. Well, you know, when you do that, they gain weight. And this poor little girl just puffed up. But she was still just as sweet as she could be. And you ask her, do you love Jesus? Oh, yeah, I love Jesus. And, you know, she would still smile, and she would break your heart. But now, when she passed away, her mother was in bed for 2 or 3 weeks. She had a loving husband that took care of everything. She just couldn't pull herself out of it right away. And I was told the other day by a friend of hers that not only did she finally come around, they adopted another child. So, you know, God blessed them in that way. So we see that some may become panicky. What am I going to do? Again, God's Word is good. I think my wife, I keep trying to tell her, I want to sit down and show you how I do the bills. Oh, I'll figure it out, you know. And I say, how are you going to take care of this big yard if I die? Oh, I'll get it done. She won't. She'll have to move, but you can't tell her anything. And so, you know, a lot of times a spouse especially, and men can be worse than women. Again, I've had a lot of experience with this. There was one over by Pure City, north of Pure City, and she came on service late, so she was only on service about a week, maybe 2. And she was about to die, and he's just, no, you know, do everything you can to keep her alive. Even if she can't talk, even if she can't do anything, he wanted her alive so she would be there. Well, she passed away, of course, and he finally coped after a while. But that's how people can get so dependent upon one another, which, you know, isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's obviously love there, and that means a lot. But there are a lot of people that will become panicky. And, you know, you may have somebody in your church that is just really a good Christian person, and they may have people in their family that are on meth. And all of a sudden you got this death situation, and here comes these people that are on meth, and they're just all panicked, and they don't know what to do. Again, you stay calm, but you have to kind of let your authority be known a little bit if things start to get out of hand. And you run into some situations like that. I've got a good friend that he was 1 year younger than me, and his daughter's about the age of my son, and she'd be in her early 40s. No, she'd probably be 45 or 6. And they haven't hardly talked to her in years. And one of the problems was she's on meth. So, and finally they're the ones that went ahead and moved to Oklahoma because they had family down there that wanted to see him and grandkids down there. Her grandkids were pretty much out of high school, or her kids were out of high school. So they decided it was time to leave. And, it's sad, but it happens. It happens to good families. That's what I'm trying to point out. Some may have guilt about the loss. I should have helped him or her go to the doctor. I should have made him go to the doctor. The patient should have took better care of himself. One lady in my church at Southside, her husband died before I got there, but after a year and a half I was there, she got to talking to me, or I got to talking to her, about her husband dying. And she was still angry because if he would have quit smoking, he wouldn't have died as quick. And she's probably right. But you've got to help them forgive him too. So that's a real case where you work with the family. You may have the wreck situation. If I was watching my driving closer, and of course nowadays we have people looking at their phones, and if you are looking at your phone and have a wreck, that's going to be, for a normal person anyway, a very guilty feeling that you're going to have. So they go through this. Anger and resentment may fill one's heart. Gary was talking about it not being fair. Just last week we had one of our church members die. Very good man. He taught school for 30 years, and he farmed while he did that. And when he quit teaching, he continued to farm. Here he was, almost 80 years old, still working on his baler. And, he told me, I can't do it as fast anymore. What I used to do in 20 or 30 minutes may take me 3 hours, but he didn't want to give up. But I was in the hospital with him, and his wife, who's just a really nice lady, she says, it isn't fair. It isn't fair. And all I could say is, life isn't fair, And, you just have to trust God. That's all I could say. That's all I knew to say. And it kind of surprised me because, they were both pushing 80. I don't think either one of them were 80, or he wasn't 80 yet. He's 78, I guess. But then I got to thinking, well, in 13 years, I'll be that age. I may very well not want to die then. Right now I may think, well, that's old. You've lived your life. But once you get up to that age, that makes it different. So you may be resentful because that wicked, drinking, smoking man down the street's 94 years old, and here my good husband, never drunk, never smoked, taught school and did all these things. He died, and that guy lives. But let's remember another thing. We're looking at things earthly. God sees things from an eternal perspective. I was the last 3 weeks in Bible study, I was teaching on Esther, and that's one of the things that really came out to me. We didn't know when Esther went there. She didn't know what was going to happen, but God did. He already knew right down the line what was going to happen. And it's that way in our lives. Gary was kind of talking about that, but sometimes when we're in the stage of God doing things, we don't really realize it till we look back and see. And that can happen in your life, and it can happen in the patient's life. I call them patients because I was a hospice chaplain so long. I guess you'd think of them as your flock if you're pastoring them. And so there may be sometimes that they become resentful. And sometimes when they do and they get angry, and they may be angry at you, don't take it personal, because they're just really angry at the situation. That you might just be the one they decide to take it out on, and they really do that without thinking. And so don't take it personal, and be willing to forgive and make up as quick as you can. We don't have every answer for every situation, but God does. God's beyond us, and we can't expect to understand everything He does. If we could understand everything God does, we wouldn't need Him because we'd be God. But, He's so far above us, and we're going to be so shocked, I think, even with what we know now, when we see the Lord face to face. It's going to be something that's just going to be way beyond what we expect, I believe, anyway. Grieving people often resist returning to normal activities, and that little graph Gary had was really great about that, because you can get stuck down there and not get back. And so that's one thing a pastor can really have a lot of help with the grieving person. Now, I have been starting to use these. I really like it. I'll just let you look at it. It's called Journeying Through Grief, and it's done by the Stephen Ministries. But what they do is they have 4 little booklets, and you don't send them out at once. You send the first one out 3 weeks after, and then the next one 3 months, and the next one 6 months, and the next one 11 months. Now, why that's good for a pastor is it helps you keep contact. Me, I'm going to go out and hand deliver it. I'm not just going to put it in the mail. And so, in a week or two, I'll take one out to Frida, the lady I was talking about, and have her read that. And another thing, it's not too big. If you hand them a book may have a lot of information, but they may never read it all. So I think them are really good, and it does help them move towards getting back to normal. And there's going to be a new normal. It'll never be the same. Grief groups are good too. When I was in hospice, we had a group for the family of the patient. No, not when I was in hospice. I'm sorry. When I worked 3 years in the nursing home, I was actually a manager of the unit. And so we had every month the family would meet, and it was kind of like grief because they'd kind of already lost their husband or brother or whatever because of the dementia and everything. And it really went good, but I've had a hard time getting a grief group going in church. And I don't know what the reason is, but I got to thinking the other day, maybe if I just set it up for 8 weeks and say we're going to do this for 8 weeks, maybe they can say, well, I'll do it for 8 weeks. And the one thing I've noticed about it, groups like that, you need 3 or 4 that are going to be there every time. And then when others come in, they won't be alone. Because if you have a new person and they're the only one that shows up, it's really rough. And so if you want to try something like that, try to get a good nucleus committed to that. I thought I had, but a couple of them backed out on me. There's lots of material, too, that you can use for that. As I said, we live in a fast-paced world. A lot of times we don't want to give people time to go through grief. A lot of times people don't want to go through grief, and they try to jump back in their normal activities too quick, and then, down the road, all of a sudden it hits them, and they may really grieve later on. Don't be afraid to share stories about their deceased one. My brother-in-law, I did his funeral. Actually, I led him to the Lord, and he was only, I don't know if he was 65 yet, but he got cancer. And of course, the chaplain from the hospice talked to him a lot, but he lives in Ohio, and I just decided I'm going to go talk to him because I knew he wasn't saved. And I talked to him, and he began to see he needed to accept Jesus, and he did. And so they had me do the funeral. Well, after the funeral, we was all back at the house and kind of sitting in chairs and everybody moping. And I said, you know what? It's okay to tell stories about Les. And they had some funny ones, and that just really helped break the tension. Funniest one was he made the kids eat popcorn with 3 fingers, because if you use 3 fingers, you're not getting enough for it to fall all over. And he was just crazy about that. But Les always thought he knew everything, so he's a good guy. Hope gradually comes back. It doesn't always come fast, but it will come back. And again, that's where Scripture helps. And books like that and things like that. God's working. Sometimes we forget that it's not us, it's God. We're just His tool. And so we put it out there and God will use it. Will it always come out the way we want? Not necessarily. But we just do what we can do and let God take over, and they have to do what they want to do. And if they're not willing to do what they should do, then it may be a struggle. And they may have a hard time coming back to church. That's another thing as a pastor that can be really disappointing if one spouse dies, especially if it's a woman. A lot of times man doesn't want to come to church alone. Usually the woman will, because they're more of a group oriented, but men are more individuals. And so sometimes it's hard to get a man to come back to church, but if they've been a good Christian and a supporter of the church, they usually will in the end. As we'd already talked about, sometimes a pat on the back is better than anything you can say, and of course, prayer. The reason I learned about prayer, when I came back to be a hospice chaplain, I was living in Edina, and had a chance to come back. It paid a lot more money than the church I was pastoring, and had benefits, and so I really felt blessed to be able to come and be a hospice chaplain, because I got back to Southwest Missouri too. I started in January, and I had a heart attack in June, 52 years old, and had a heart attack. And man, I didn't know what was going on. Fortunately, it wasn't very bad, and it didn't do any damage, but they did have to put a stent in. But that's the first time I'd ever been under that situation, and I had one of the other chaplains from the Springfield hospice office come and visit me. And I mean, him talking to me a little bit and just praying with me meant so much. I didn't realize how much it might mean to people until I went through it myself. So don't ever underestimate your visit and your praying with them. Usually I don't stay a real long time. If somebody's pretty good and they're feeling pretty good and they're pretty talkative, I'll stay longer. But 15 minutes or so, unless they're really feeling pretty good, it's about enough, because they're not necessarily up to visitors anyway, but they do appreciate you praying for them. We go back to the struggle to accept reality, and it's not as it was before. There's a new reality. As Gary said, a new normal, and we can help people understand that also. You're not going to be exactly like you were before. It's kind of like the river's never the same, because that drop of water's already moved down 2 feet, and it's never the same, and they shouldn't, or you can help them realize that they shouldn't expect it to be the same. And it'll change, but God will still be with you, and you'll learn to live with it, and you'll learn to find happiness and joy, if you just let the Lord work it out with you. Loss is a hard thing. Sometimes it does make people weaker, and sometimes it really makes you cling to God and become stronger. Gary talked about the children. I had 2 brothers, you know them, Ernie, Alan and Jim, that married sisters, Kenita and Nancy. And first, Alan's and Nancy's daughter got sick with cancer, and she died when she was 12 years old. They'd taken her up to the hospital in Minnesota several times, but she just wasn't going to live any longer. And the other one was 12 years old, a couple years, I don't know, maybe 3-4 years later. And you know what? She drowned in her backyard pool. And what happened to her is she hit the ladder. She was swimming under the water, and she hit the ladder. It didn't hit it hard, but it threw her head back and it closed up everything. And even though her mother knew CPR, they couldn't get her to where she could breathe again. And so both of them, and I was kind of concerned, but their marriage held together, and I was real glad to hear that. And they're all going to church at Miller still. And so, it does make a difference if you're in church and you're involved. But I've also seen a case where One of them was a youth pastor, the one I'm particularly thinking of, and that was up in Springfield when I lived there. And him and his wife ended up divorcing. And you know, his dad was a pastor, it ran in his family, and they were both good Christians, but he just couldn't help but blame her. He thought, should have taken that kid to the hospital when he got that sick. And of course she was told, well, he's just got the flu, he'll be okay. And so you never know. But that was pretty sad that they broke up. Anyway, that's some of the situations you get in. It is a struggle to get back to your new normal. And you need to watch that, either growing faith. Okay, well, I've got a little ending here. Yes. In my 10 years as a chaplain, as I said, I was probably involved with at least 1,000 different patients and their families. And I can tell you without hesitation, an active Christian walk makes all the difference in the world in how they handle death. You know, when I started as a chaplain, you know, I was kind of afraid to have to go in and talk to these people that are dying. But the ones that were Christians and in church, almost every time I came out feeling better than when I went in. You know, because they had confidence in where they was going. And one of them was just over there at Monette. He was maybe 45 years old, but he'd been in church, and him and his wife were just really strong Christians. And, you know, he just looked at it as, I'm going on home. I get to go before you. And she says, yeah, and you're going to leave me here alone. But she was grieving over it more than he was at that particular time. But I've seen a lot of older people, particularly, you know, they look forward to going home. I've heard that I don't know how many times. And then there's a lot of pretenders out there, and they get pretty panicky when it gets to the end, and it does make a difference. So anybody tell you that the church isn't needed, they don't understand Jesus, because he set the church up. And that's where we come. We can worship him at home, and we can worship in other places, but that's where we should continue to come to minister and fellowship and to be our headquarters, to be strengthened back and that type of thing. The greatest, I've got this marked, so I hope it's good. The greatest minister, pastor, teacher, or Christian worker can do, the best he can do is help people grow in their faith in the Lord Jesus. That's what I was trying to say. The best thing you can do is just help them grow in their faith. Gary was saying, pushing them a little closer, you know, and that's the best we can do. And some of them grow tremendously, and some of them won't grow much at all, and some will grow a little. And so that's our ministry, just to help people come closer to Jesus. And sometimes tragedy is something that brings people closer to the Lord. Now, I don't know if it's true or not, but I heard that there was an atheist in that shooting in Las Vegas, and after he lived through that he became a Christian. Now, you know, you see things and hear things. I don't have any way to confirm that, but I've also heard that there's no atheist in foxholes, and I don't know about that either. I never had to go to war. I'm sure there probably is nowadays, but you get the idea. Tragedies will make you think about death and the hereafter. And that's why I say when you preach a funeral, preach Jesus, because you don't know who's out in the crowd. And it may be somebody out there will get saved. Maybe not right then, maybe not in a year, but somewhere down the line it may make all the difference in the world. So we keep trying to push people closer to the Lord, and I agree with Gary 100% about trying to take care of ourselves, although I'm not too good at it. So maybe that ought to be a goal for me this year, is to work more at taking care of myself.